Hi everyone, welcome to this new edition of the Reg Europe Hangout. Today we are super excited to have um, Tanmai from Hasura. Hi, Tanmai, how are you doing?
Hey, how are you, Patrick? Hey, everyone.
So, how is everything on your side, Tanmai?
Going along. You know, we're in tough times, but things seem to be okay at least for us. And I think the team has also been safe and healthy by and large. So things are okay.
Okay, nice. So, I will let you share your screen and then we'll take a question from the audience. Are you okay with people asking during the stream or do you prefer after the stream?
I'm okay with people asking during the stream as well.
Okay,
That's fine.
so
Cool.
I will interrupt you if there are any questions.
Awesome. All right. So let us. Cool. I'm hoping you can see. Can you see, Patrick?
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. So hi everyone. I'm one of the founders at Hasura. Created one of the creators of Hasura as well. Created Hasura a long time ago on Mongo, many years ago before GraphQL, and then our current architect, our lead engineer Vamshi, he came along and he's like, "Why is this on Mongo? Replace it." And he replaced it with Postgres. But yeah, we've been building Hasura for a while now. We added GraphQL support about 1.5 years ago when we open sourced Hasura as well. And Hasura is basically the idea behind Hasura is to kind of automate the data API portion that you very frequently have to build. So you kind of take Hasura, you point it to upstream sources like a database, and Hasura introspects a database. You can add in some configuration, and then you get a GraphQL API. Today, what I'll be talking about is a powerful feature that we've just landed, called Actions. And Actions allow you to extend the GraphQL API, and we do this in a fairly unique way that nobody else does, and that leads to certain unique advantages. And I'll talk about that a little bit. So before I get started and before I talk about Actions, I'm going to just talk about Hasura a little bit and do a 5-10 minute demo, give you a sense of what Hasura does, to kind of motivate where actions are coming from. And I'll spend about 5-10 minutes on that initial Hasura demo, and then we'll kind of dive into actions. All right. So as usual, I shall do a quick start and deploy this live. So the way Hasura runs is Hasura is not a GraphQL library or a framework. What it does is it's basically a service. It's like GraphQL as a service. And so what I'll do is, let's say React Europe. Let's see if that's available. All right, that's not available. Let's say 2020. Okay, cool. Um, and so Hasura is a GraphQL as a service, and it runs inside a Docker container. So wherever you can run Docker, you can run Hasura, right? And so what we've done right now is I've gone to Heroku and I've said, Heroku, can you run Hasura, the Docker container for us? And can you give us a Postgres database as well, right? And so what Heroku is doing is basically deploying the Docker image, and setting up a Postgres database for us, right? Heroku is really convenient to kind of get started with a deployment, especially if you're a front-end developer, because you don't want to deal with the back-end deployment and whatnot. And Heroku has a really nice way of kind of helping you deploy stuff. Even scaling stuff out and whatnot is nice. All right. So as soon as you deploy Hasura, what you'll see is you will see a console, a UI, and we call this the Hasura console. And on the Hasura console, that's basically our GraphQL endpoint. So as we build applications, our applications will be hitting that GraphQL endpoint, and running GraphQL queries on it, right? So the first thing that we'll do is, this is like the quick 30-second use case for Hasura, right? So I have let's say users table. I'll add an ID, and then I'll add a name, right? And then I'll create this table. And as soon as I create this table, I'm just going to insert some data inside this table, right? So this is just standard database stuff, nothing new. And so now what Hasura does is it generates a GraphQL API, and I can use that GraphQL API, right? Just a super straightforward use case, right? And you can do lots of fancy filtering and whatnot on that GraphQL API. So just to kind of move this demo along quickly, what I'll do is I'll import an existing data set, so that we can try out queries, mutations, and subscriptions just to see what the API looks like. And then we'll kind of dive into extending that API. So what I'm going to do is connect directly to the database. There we go, right? and I am just, so let me just do that. So that's me connecting directly to the database, the Postgres database. And that's the users table that I just made on the UI, right? If you're not familiar with databases, don't worry about it too much. What I'm basically doing is it's as if I have a database backup, right? Which has the data models and which has the data inside it already. And what I'm basically doing is I'm importing that data backup, right? So it's as if I'm just importing a new database. And so now what this is doing is it's going and doing a bunch of database things. It's creating the right tables, and it's going to start importing data inside it in a few minutes as well, in a few hopefully seconds as well. So there we go. It's starting to insert data as well. So let's just take a quick look at what I'm doing here. Let me go back to my. Let me just adjust my screen a little bit. All right. Okay. So what we're doing here, and let's just look at the schema that we have. So Chinook. All right. So that's the database that I'm importing. Just to give you a sense of, like, it's a music database, right? There's artists, albums. It's a standard database that I use for my demos. And there's artists and albums and music tracks and stuff, right? And so what happens is that the Hasura console, as soon as I load the console, it says, hey, you know what? These are the tables in your database. What do you want to do with them? And so I say, track them all, right? I want all of them on GraphQL. And so what Hasura is doing is it's basically creating an internal kind of entry or configuration. Like as soon as I use the UI, Hasura has kind of created configuration to say, these are the tables that we want to expose as GraphQL types, right? And then Hasura also tells us that there are kind of like these relationships, right? Every artist, every album has an artist ID and stuff like that, which basically help us join across these models. And so I'm going to track those relationships as well, right? And we'll just give this another second. Let me load this here. I mean, we are on a free tier. So okay, there we go. All right, so let's. So what I can do now is I can run a query and I can say I'd like to query albums. And if I look at the music albums, I can query music albums. So I'm not sure if I'm going to get too much data right now because data is still importing, but those are the albums that we have, right? And then as soon as these relationships get added, which they have, let's just refresh this page. And so what I can also do is query for the artist of the album, right? So there we go. So that's a query where I'm running album and I want to fetch the artist of the album. Pretty straightforward, right? I can do all kinds of fancy filtering as well, right? So I can do albums. I want albums where the artist, or let's sort the albums. I want to sort the album by the name of the artist, ascending order, right? I don't want to sort the albums by like their title. I want to sort it by a property, right? And so now I get albums which are sorted by Aaron first, and then I think the last thing will be something else, right? Zika Pagodino. All right, so that's kind of what like the basic Hasura GraphQL API looks like, right? What's also nice here is you get mutations and stuff like that. But what's particularly nice is things like subscriptions. So just to give you an example of that, we have some music tracks in our system, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to fetch the count of music tracks that we have. And so you'll see that it's 85. And if I run the count of tracks, it's 101. The reason why the count is increasing is because I'm still importing data, right? What I can do is I can convert this to a subscription. And what you'll see is that this value is kind of changing on its own, right? And this is nice because as a front end developer building an application, I just need to care about, there's something changing in the database. Can I subscribe to it? I can subscribe to it, and it'll work. And Hasura takes care of making sure that the subscriptions are reliable, that they're scalable, giving you all kinds of monitoring on it, telling you how many concurrent users you have, dealing with WebSocket security, dealing with GraphQL subscription security, and all of that is kind of built into Hasura, right? Which makes it neat. This is this is nice because I get like a full GraphQL API over my database, but this is not necessarily useful in practice without a layer of security. And so what you can do with Hasura is add permissions that allow you to access only those GraphQL APIs that you're allowed to access. So for example, let's say right now I'm an admin, so I can access everything, right? I can do queries, I can do mutations that insert, update, and delete. But let's say I'm a user, and a logged in user can only select data that belongs to them. So an artist can only come in and select their profile entry, right? So I can only select it if ID is equal to something like a token user ID, right? This might come in from your authentication system like Auth0 or Firebase Auth, or like maybe your custom login, logout, or your custom authentication service, right? So as soon as I do this, right, and I go back to graphical, right, and let's say I set the role to user, you'll notice that I can only subscribe or run a query, right, on artists, right? And even if I try to fetch all of the artists, I won't actually be able to fetch anybody else's data except for my own data, right? And so this is just a basic permission example, but you can do fairly complex permissions as well, right? You can have documents where document.editors contains me, or document.collaborators contains me, right? You can do all kinds, or document is public, right? Whatever that combination of permission rules that you have, or constraints that you have, that give you access to data. And so this kind of helps you kind of create a good CRUD API on your database that's secure, that's scalable, that works well, right? And Hasura is doing a lot of the optimizations around performance, around authorization checking, and stuff like that. Just to show you one example of where that performance starts to matter, let me go back to running this as an admin, right? And let's say I query for artists, and I query for their albums, and for each album I fetch their tracks, right? So this is a fairly intense query, right? I am fetching a massive amount of data, right? And you can see that it runs fairly quickly, right? If you look at the amount of data that I'm fetching, it's quite a bit, right? We're still importing data, but it's a fair amount of data, and especially for GraphQL, that runs in a particular way, it's a fair amount of processing to do. Um, what Hasura does is it compiles it into one database query, and I don't need to get into details, but it compiles it into one database query that kind of efficiently runs and gives you that data, right? Which is nice. So you kind of have these CRUD benefits, but one of the things that you'll have to do, as you kind of build out your GraphQL API, is that you'll want to add custom logic that does particular things. Sometimes those things might not even have anything to do with the database, right? Sometimes those things might not, or might execute something very custom on the database, right? Like, let's say it's an e-commerce order, and if I place an order, I need to do many checks, right? Maybe I need to check if that vendor is still open, and I need to talk to an external API to do that. I need to send an email. I need to register a shipment, right? I need to check the inventory, right? I need to do a bunch of things. And thinking about things in just a CRUD style doesn't scale anymore, right? You're thinking about things in terms of more like actions that are relevant for your users. In fact, GraphQL mutations, when they were designed, were one of the things that the creators talk about often is how GraphQL mutations sound like you're mutating data, but GraphQL mutations are actually intended to be more like actions, where you're not doing too many CRUD style mutations, but you're doing more actions. So mutation doesn't represent a mutation of a resource. A mutation actually represents an action. And if you look at GraphQL design itself, like the fact that GraphQL mutations have input types which are completely different and have nothing to do with query types, is a reflection of this design, right? But in any case, the idea is that we want to extend our logic. Now, what we done for what we released several months ago is a feature called remote schemas, which would allow you to add your own GraphQL servers, and Hasura would automatically compose that into a GraphQL API. What we've launched recently is actions, which allow you to do a similar thing, but with REST APIs but with REST APIs backing it, and not GraphQL servers backing it, right? So let's take a really simple example and try it out, right? I'm going to create an action, uh, which is a query. So we'll do mutations later. Let's start off with a query that does a hello world, right? And it just, like, that's it. It doesn't look at the data. It doesn't do anything. It just makes up data, and it says hello world, right? So let's call it hello output. So what I'm doing at the Hasura level is I'm registering the GraphQL kind of contract, right? Which is basically in the GraphQL SDL. So I'll say greetings string, right? I'm going to ignore this handler. This is the URL of our REST API. So we're going to ignore this right now. And I'm going to create this. So as soon as I do this, what you'll notice is that if I go back to graphical, I'll see a query, and I'll have hello here, right? This won't run, right? And this has greeting, right? This won't run, right? So you'll say like exception when calling webhook, but that's the query that we've created. The next thing that we'll do is we'll back this up with some code, right? And so what so what Hasura also does for you is it gives you a little bit of code gen to help you bootstrap this small function that you need to write. And this is a great fit with serverless functions, especially if you're a front-end heavy developer, right? And you like JavaScript, or you like building serverless functions, and you don't want to build a service and deploy it and take care of it. You can just kind of take this code, right, and just run it on your favorite serverless provider, right? In this case, just kind of to make it a nice demo, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Glitch, which is kind of like a code sandbox. Uh, I think Glitch is older than Code Sandbox, which is why I still use Glitch, but everybody else that I talk to is already using Code Sandbox. But you can use Code Sandbox for doing this as well, right? Doesn't matter. The point is, I just wanted an editor in my browser to show you what this looks like. So what I'm going to do is I have this Express service, right? Um, and I'm going to just add this code gen here. So let's take this code and let's add that. Oops, let me copy that and let me paste that here. All right, and let's change that to hello React Europe 2020, right? So what this is doing is this is exposing a hello like URL, like a route, and it returns data, right? So far so good, nothing particularly complicated. Let's look at what the URL of this like serverless function or service or whatever is. So that's the URL. So I'm going to just take that back here and just set that to be the URL. And our endpoint was /hello. Oops, /hello, right? All right. So as soon as I save that, I'm just going to go run this function again, right? And you can see that I get React Europe 2020. This is nice, right? And this kind of this basically allows me to kind of just deal with REST APIs. I don't have to deal with GraphQL validation, with GraphQL caching or GraphQL query plan caching or anything. This and in fact, I don't even have to deal with a lot of the performance aspects of GraphQL. And let's take a look. Let's take an example of what that looks like. So let's say that my action doesn't actually return like a greeting, but let's say it returns an artist, right? So what I'll do is I'll make it return an artist, right? And so let's say that it returns an artist, right? It's not returning like a greeting string anymore, but it's returning an artist, right? And what I'll do is I'll just make this return an artist ID, and let's just return it to 1. Let's say I'm doing something special, right? I'm doing something special. I'm doing some business logic, right? Maybe I make some API calls, it does something, whatever. Doesn't matter. But let's say at the end of the day, I finally return an artist ID, right? That's my REST API. And now in this case, as soon as I do that, right? Let's first check if everything's working. So let's go and make this artist ID. Let me refresh this so that we have the latest schema here. All right, cool. So we're getting artist ID 1. This is nice, but what I really want to do is I want the entire artist object, right? Now I have two options, right? Either I can implement the artist type here and then, kind of make sure that like I get the artist type from the database and then make sure I return the artist type here in my REST API. But that's a lot of work. That's like just rebuilding like an entire GraphQL server, which I don't want to do, right? So what I can do is I can create a relationship, right? And I can say that I want to return an artist using my artist ID as a reference into the artist type that already exists, right? So as soon as I do this, what happens is that in my GraphQL schema, let me refresh this again, is I will now get to traverse the entire artist object. And then in fact, I can fetch albums, right? And the GraphQL aspects of it are taken care of by Hasura, right? To ensure that like the GraphQL query is validated, to ensure that the query plan is cached, to ensure that the join that is run after that runs with the same Hasura kind of performance characteristics that you're used to. And your business logic is kind of literally doing just what your business logic needs to do and is returning the minimal amount of data that you need to return or references to data that already exists. You might return a new type entirely, but maybe you're just returning a reference to something that already exists, right? So this kind of is a convenient model, right? Let's take another example of looking at like what adding some custom business logic to Hasura might look like. So let's say, for example, I want to create an action that I want to have like a really custom method to create an artist, right? I don't want to use a Hasura mutation to insert an artist because I need to do a bunch of things, right? And so I want to have a create artist, and the create artist will take just the name as an input. and then it will return an artist ID or a reference to a newly created artist, right? So the way to do this in Hasura and the way we've tried to make it simple is what you can do is you can first go and try the mutation out. So let's go and try this mutation out of what mutation we wished we were running, right? So I can run a mutation. It can be insert artist. So let's do insert artist one, and let's see what that takes. So I'll insert a name, and I always wanted to be an artist. So that's me. Uh, got stuck in engineering somehow. Don't know how that happened. Anyway, I created an artist, right? So let's change that to using variables instead. So let's say $name string, and let's make that $name, right? Okay, cool. So this is kind of the mutation that we want to do underneath, right? Whatever. Right? All right, cool. So this is the mutation that we want to run underneath, but we want to wrap it with our own business logic that does stuff, right? Maybe we want to validate the way name is, or maybe we want to pull some data from like, I don't know, Bandcamp. Is it called Bandcamp? Whatever, SoundCloud, Bandcamp, something, right? I want to pull some data about this artist and try to seed some data. I want to do things like magical things, right? And so what I can do here is I can derive an action using this underlying mutation, right? So I derive this action. And so let's call this action a create user. So let's say create user, right? And then let's just say create, let's call it create artist output. There we go, create artist, right? And let's say create artist output will return an ID, right? And that ID is just an integer, that's fine, right? As soon as I create this, right, I'll have a create artist mutation that shows up automatically, which is nice. But what I'll also have is I'll have CodeGen to actually run this and create this artist myself in my own serverless function. So let's see what that mutation looks like, right? I've not organized this particularly well, but doesn't matter. And so what this is doing is this is basically, I can run my own business logic here. If you look at the code here, right, I extract the name from the input as an argument. I run my own business logic, and then I insert it back into Hasura, right? I just use a standard GraphQL API. I insert it back into Hasura, and I move on with my life, right? So I get to I use GraphQL. I use GraphQL to do more database stuff that I need to do, but I control that as an admin or as a backend developer or in the backend context. And otherwise, I'm just writing whatever code I need to do, right? So maybe like I scrape data from SoundCloud, right? Whatever. I don't know how to do this. And so as soon as I have this, what I can now do is just change this to the create artist function here. So let's go in and make sure that we have the right endpoint. So I'm just going to go in here, add the right endpoint, create artist, right? Cool. And save this. And now what I can do is I can go back to our graphical and I can say mutation, create artist, right? Which just takes a name now, right? Tanmai, and which returns a ID, right? And sorry, there we go, right? And so that's a new artist 278 that just got created, right? And then again, I can do the same relationship business and I can get the artist back and whatnot, right? So so this kind of workflow makes it easy to even override Hasura mutations or to compose a bunch of Hasura mutations together and build your own kind of business logic on top of this, right? I'm not going to go into too many details, but or speak much longer, and I can take some questions towards the end. But that is the idea behind actions. To quickly kind of motivate some of the design aspects, I recently wrote up a blog post. So let me see, introducing actions Hasura. Right, all right, there we go. Cool. So kind of like 5 aspects that I quickly want to stress on over the next 2 minutes, and then we can kind of take questions. The first is the reason behind kind of designing Hasura in a way where like we really like, for example, REST APIs, is that you can continue adding complex or whatever business logic you want as in a REST service. Now, good thing about a REST service is that the ecosystem that you have around REST frameworks is very, very rich, right? A lot of the GraphQL ecosystem is unfortunately still centered around JavaScript and TypeScript, and there is a lot of growth, especially in the GraphQL Java ecosystem, for example. But for example, in the .NET ecosystem or in other kind of GraphQL ecosystems, building GraphQL servers is not as mature as the equivalents in the rest world, right? And this is not just frameworks, but this is also for the rest of the tooling that you have, especially in enterprise environments, right? Like the tooling that you have to secure your REST endpoints, to deploy your REST endpoints, to monitor them, to do health checks. All of these are really figured out for REST services, but they're not really figured out for GraphQL services. For example, doing a health check on a GraphQL endpoint is hard because just as a trivial example, right? Because with a REST service, you can monitor status codes to see what's happening. But with a GraphQL service, you have to monitor the response that you get. And monitoring the response is hard because nobody logs responses, because logging a response is a security vulnerability. You can't send the response of your data to a third-party service to give you a health check on it, right? You could have sent a status code, but you can't send the response body, right? So these are some trivial reasons behind why the REST ecosystem is a little bit mature than the GraphQL ecosystem. Well, not trivial reasons, but simple reasons. And it becomes much easier to kind of build REST services and REST APIs that do stuff. What we wanted to do with Hasura was to make it easy to say, you kind of have REST APIs, you deploy them however you want, you deploy them with serverless functions or with microservices, whatever framework you want, and then you can just kind of bring them together at Hasura. And what Hasura will do is ensure that Hasura security and Hasura performance kind of handles that well, without kind of locking you into a particular way of writing business logic in terms of the framework, the language, or the runtime that you have. I have some more details on the kind of the architectural pattern. This is kind of like the command and query architectural pattern that I talk about, which is on this blog post. But we can spend the next few minutes on questions. And then, of course, if you have any more questions, you can always reach out to me on Twitter or email or Discord. All right, thank you. That's me.
Thanks. That's awesome. I really like the relationship that you show off with the actions. So this
Thank
means
you. Yes.
like if I'm using Stripe and I want to get the charge ID from Stripe, and then I can match it with a product I sold on the database. Is that
exactly
something I could do?
exactly
That's very
yeah.
powerful. So I don't have to wait for Stripe to implement a GraphQL API.
Yep, you don't. And the nice thing is also that the security rules will apply. So like, for example, if you're fetching the product data, right? If you have security rules defined on product, in that I can only view like 3 or 4 fields of the particular product, right? When even in the response, I'll only be able to get like the response that I have access to. So all of those security rules will get applied automatically. Like if you're the code that you have to process the charge, that doesn't have to care about anything else, right? It just has to do the Stripe work, return the charge ID and the product ID, and that's it, done.
That's great. At the beginning, you show how to import your PostgreSQL database. I think you have a tool to do migrations. Could you tell us a bit about? We don't have to do it manually, right? You have.
No, you don't have to do these manually. Let me see. I might actually have an example running. All right, cool. I have something running locally. That's awesome. So let's do this. Awesome. So this is me running Hasura locally with Docker, right? So if I do a Docker PS, I have Hasura running, right? And I have a database as well, right? What I can do is, instead of opening up the console, right? This is the console served by Hasura itself. I can use the CLI to open up the console. So let's say Hasura console, right? And now I get the UI, right? As usual, nothing special. I can go and create some tables. So let me say like whatever, artists and ID and name. I'm a very creative data modeling person. And then as soon as I do this, right? Like, maybe I created a table, maybe I go and modify the table, right? I add a new column or I do whatever, right? Anything that I do here, or I add a new permission, let's say, for example, let's say user permission, user can select all of this data, right? So I've done some database stuff and I did some Hasura stuff. I did the database stuff of creating the table. I did some Hasura stuff of creating permissions. What happens is, as I use this, think of the Hasura UI kind of like an IDE, right? It's kind of like a graphical IDE, right? What's happening is that it's essentially updating a bunch of files that I have here. So if I look at if I look at the migration files, that's my migration, right? So I can do, oops. So Hasura automatically generates the SQL migration that you have. And now you can take this migration and you can do Hasura migrate apply, right? and you can say whatever, myproductionhasura.com, right? And then it'll apply these latest migrations to wherever your production server is, right? And Hasura also generates the down migrations. So that means that if you're collaborating, you want to do like, you want to delete a few migrations, you want to go down, you want to go back, whatever. Hasura tries to generate the down migrations as well. Down migrations are hard, and so Hasura generates them best effort. And whenever it doesn't, it gives you a comment and says, please write the down migration yourself. So for example, sometimes renaming columns or changing indexes and whatnot, the down migration is not straightforward. I mean, it's a database thing. But also what I also have is the new metadata that gets added. So let's take a look at the metadata, right? And so where's my artist table? There we go. And so the artist table, and that's the permission that I created, right? And so that gets added as well, right? So technically, I could have written and done everything that I did on Hasura with configuration. I could have just done that by writing these files out manually, right? I could have just created the right JSON that represents the configuration. I could have just done the SQL myself. I can do that, or I can just use the UI. And then, whenever I feel like the UI is not powerful enough, I want to do like a rename, right? I want to rename all these tables or something. I want to rename the user role to something else, right? I can just go back to the text file and edit the text file, right? And then I can just use the CLI to do a Hasura migrate apply, a Hasura metadata apply, right? And then do endpoint, whatever, myproductionhasura.com. So that's the migration tooling that Hasura has. It's fairly unopinionated. So that means if you don't want to use Hasura for database migrations, you want to use something else, you have an existing database, maybe you're using Rails migrations, right? You have a Rails server. Hasura won't touch the migrations. You only use Hasura for metadata, right? Which is like the Hasura permissions and the relationships and stuff like that. You don't do the database stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So when I started using Hasura, I was doing it manually for the jobs Rack Europe
Right.
website, and now I would like to use this tool because it's more convenient. So I'm thinking using a down migration from production and then using it in my dev environment. Does that
Yeah,
make sense? And
yeah,
then
you can do that, or if you have an existing project, then you can also just do like you can just do Hasura init, and then you can initialize it from the server. And let's say you have a production server, like whatever this was, right?
yeah.
And then you can just give that as a URL, and Hasura will initialize the project, and it'll initialize the first migration, which will contain the entire SQL and the first metadata. So that will already be there, and that will be like your starting checkpoint. So you
Okay.
don't need to do it now, and then you can just start off from that point. That will also be totally fine.
Cool. That's what I will do then. Um, I saw you tweeting about rewriting the console in Reason and then TypeScript. And what's up with the new version?
Rewrite.
Is this
That's
something you
true.
can talk about,
So
or?
yeah, absolutely. So there was a lot of back and forth. We use Haskell on the back end, so we're big fans of typed function programming. And the front end, the console is all JavaScript. The front end console actually is a really old code base. We started using React, almost in the first days of when React came out. And some of the early stuff that we had was actually, I don't know if any of you remember, like the Flux pattern with React that used to be a big deal.
Yeah.
And then there was ACD Lite had a repo called Flumux, which was a implementation of Flux. And so we had that, and it was really complicated. Like there was a lot of action creators and actions and lots of crazy things going on in the React code base. So the console work actually started in that time, and this was before GraphQL. Hasura used to have its own JSON API and stuff. And then over time, of course, we moved to Redux, and now the console is basically React and Redux and stuff like that. When we were kind of thinking about upgrading our console code base, and the primary problem that we were running into, right, the two biggest problems that we have on the console is one, that there's kind of data fetch. There's a lot of data that's being fetched in the console, and so there's a lot of data fetch optimization that need to happen, especially if you have thousands of tables and stuff. And so that's kind of one aspect, right, which is and the other aspect is that as we add more features, because the console code base has become very large. In fact, on GitHub, we get classified as a JavaScript project because it's mostly console code in terms of lines of code. Then there were like lots of errors that were sneaking in because of just not being rigorous with types, right?
Mhm.
And so when we were thinking about migrating it, we were thinking about ReasonML, we were thinking about TypeScript. And so Alexandra, who's our tech lead on the console, she wrote a really nice blog post on evaluating Reason versus TypeScript versus pure script. I don't know. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. A nice blog post that evaluates kind of like the different languages that we had. And so of course we're big fans of Reason and Elm and PureScript. In fact, Phil, who created PureScript and still works actively, is works on the Hasura server team. And so we were evaluating all of these things, but we finally decided to go for TypeScript because um, from a community standpoint and from
Yeah.
a risk standpoint, it was one of the easiest things to do, and from an incremental migration standpoint, it was also fairly easy. Incremental migration is easy. All of the different languages have incremental migration that's possible, but with TypeScript, it's definitely the easiest in terms of also the libraries that you're using. A lot of people have created TypeScript definitions or bindings for those libraries, and that makes it easy to gradually migrate your code base. And so a lot of those benefits you start realizing with TypeScript fairly early on. The other big thing for us was that we also wanted to make the console code base accessible for our users and contributors to also build on, right? And choosing something like ReasonML would have severely restricted the ability for people to kind of contribute, right?
Yeah.
It would have increased the learning curve, and so TypeScript has helped. And just because and just from kind of announcing that we're kind of using TypeScript, and in the last few weeks we've received several community contributions, super helpful, that have really helped kind of move the console code base forward. And that's been amazing. So TypeScript seemed to have been like the right choice.
And will it have a completely new UX and stuff, or is it just
So
writing
we're
TypeScript?
no, we're rewriting some of the internal code bases to fix some of the portions where there's you know especially liable to kind of being buggy. So we're doing that, but we're also looking at a UI overhaul, specifically adding a bunch of like CMS style features for the data browser and for administering the data. Being able to, we covered that in our community call, and there's a recording that you can check out, which has you can navigate like foreign keys. You can insert, when you insert an element that is a reference, inserting that becomes much easier. You can have permissions on who gets to access what tables, right? From a data admin point of view, let's say, for
Hmm.
example, I'm a manager and I only get to see artists and users. I don't get to see this weird table called ASDF. But so we can kind of create permissions, not just for the GraphQL API, but those permissions will also get applied for the data admin UI, and those kinds of things. So we're looking at doing a bunch of those kinds of
So
things
so
as
if I
well.
use Hasura for my CMS, I can hand the UI to non-technical people. That's the goal.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's the goal. That's the
Cool.
goal, right?
Cool.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of users are already using Hasura like that, but they have to be extra careful, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a bit
They have to
scary.
be a little more careful. Yeah. So, but now people will be able to kind of do that more easily.
Okay. I have a couple of questions from the audience. So, someone is asking, last week you were worried about the security aspect of the whole Hasura ecosystem. I didn't understand. Can you talk more about it? About it?
I'm not sure uh, what that question means. Maybe you could get Patrick. If you could you paste that for me on the Zoom chat, I can take a look.
Yeah,
Might be easier for me.
it's on the YouTube also. But I'll pass it.
Ah, okay.
Um, okay, I sent it. You got it?
Oh, okay. I was worried about the security aspect. I was proud of the security aspect. Is the way I'd like to put it. We talked quite a bit about the security enhancements that we made to Hasura in the last community call. So we added some more features on the permission system that Hasura itself has, and so that's what we were talking about. But no, nothing that I'm particularly worried about. Yeah, in fact, it's like the Hasura security system is quite nice because you get to specify authorization rules at a model level, which makes it really convenient because however your resolvers are, like whether you fetch artists and then albums, or you fetch albums and their artists, right? However you fetch that data, it's convenient because the same authorization rules kick in. This becomes a little tedious if you think about building your own API, whether it's a REST API or a GraphQL API, because you have to make sure that you're using the right authorization rules, or they're specified at a model level and not at a controller level, or you have to do a bunch of things, and then you have to optimize that with the data fetch, right? You don't want to make one API call to the database, or like one database call to fetch the permission check, and then another database call to fetch the data, right? And as you're fetching larger amounts of data, it's just like lots of database stuff that's happening, and then you have to optimize it and whatnot. All of that Hasura kind of takes care of automatically. So which is kind of like which is one of the big benefits of Hasura. So uh, being able to use that, and being able to use that along with actions when you write your custom business logic is a big win. And so anyway, I'm not sure if that's the question that you had,
Okay.
but
He specified that it was a friend of his that was worried about the security.
okay. Feel free to kind of reach out with any specific questions that you have. Would help to would love to kind of help you walk you through that.
Okay. Um, Someone is asking when can we expect 1.3 beta release?
We're gearing for this sometime this week for a beta release, but hopefully sometime next week, definitely. We'll have schedule triggers and remote joins. The two of our
Nice.
two really amazing features. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, well, someone is asking when will relay be available?
So I think we've done most of the relay work. We should be having a preview sometime this week. It should be a part of the 1.3 release, and you should be able to try it out and start integrating with it and playing around with it with a preview release that we make sometime this week. So yeah, that should happen. But with 1.3, you'll definitely be able to start integrating relay. I am so excited about relay as well. Yeah, I did not understand relay for a long time, so a lot of my excitement is just understanding relay. But the kind of happiness that you get when you understand something. So yeah, relay is going to be amazing.
So
Uh,
so you're saying we will be able to start using it on with 1.3 already?
Yes. So basically, you'll have two endpoints. You'll have a v1/GraphQL and a v1/relay/GraphQL. So you'll have two GraphQL endpoints. So we'll also serve the relay GraphQL API and the simplified GraphQL API.
Okay. Um, so uh, when you ended your presentation, you said that there were a couple of points you could talk about still about action. What was it? I didn't have time to catch it.
Yeah, I can go into a little more detail about the kind of stuff that I've talked about in the blog post, specifically about a pattern called the command inquiry pattern, which is but it's kind of like a back-end architectural design things. If you want, I can talk about it a little bit.
Sure.
So so the kind of two broad architectures for thinking about APIs, right? So one is like your CRUD based API. So where you think about like the Kubernetes API is an amazing example of an amazing CRUD REST API. It is very it uses REST verbs in the right way, right? It has you have resources, and then you can post, put, patch, delete, right? You can even watch on those endpoints on some of these resources, right? So everything is like resource driven, and then you have APIs that operate on resources, and this works. But as your application evolves, you'll notice that although a big chunk of your application is is kind of CRUD, right? The other big chunk that you have, not necessarily big, it depends on like what your application is doing, but the other chunk that you will notice is they're kind of like not around domain entities or models or resources, but they're kind of more around actions, right? Like what I was talking about with like placing an order, which is a workflow. So you're actually triggering a workflow, or you're triggering a series of steps that might involve, in fact, like you might touch multiple models, you might read and update multiple models, you might talk to other services, right? You might do a bunch of other things. And so when you think about designing that kind of a system, one of the architectural patterns that has been around is a command and query pattern. So the CQS pattern and the CQRS patterns, right? And one of the ideas behind the command and query pattern is that the user sends a command. The command could be read or write, doesn't matter. The user sends a command, and then the handler or the controller for what the command is doing actually goes and runs business logic. This business logic might involve creating or updating resources that are resources or models, right? The response of the command, right, that the user gets, the response of the command that the user gets is a query of those updated models, right? So the way you kind of organize your backend architecture is you have a set of models that are optimized for what people want to read and query, right? So you think about and these may not be necessarily normalized models, they could be denormalized models, right? But they're kind of optimized for viewing or querying or reading. right? And your command side is basically doing stuff that might be updating multiple models, and then you read from it. Now, this could be synchronous or this could be asynchronous, right? So for example, in a CQRS implementation, which includes event sourcing, it might be that you fire a command, right? And then you don't get the response immediately. You subscribe to the response, or you poll the response, or you wait for the response, which is when the command finishes executing, it updates a bunch of models, and then you read those updated models, right? Whenever they update. Or it can be synchronous, where the command and query kind of pattern is something behind the HTTP system, right? It's not the HTTP request fires off a command, does stuff, and then the HTTP response has the query. And that's in fact what the Hasura action system is designed like, right? You have, whenever you create a GraphQL query or mutation, Hasura maps that as an action or as a command and delivers that to a REST API endpoint, which is a handler, which can go and do a bunch of things, right? Maybe it goes and updates Stripe, maybe it updates some models, it does something, and the response, which is assembling the response that the user wants, is actually done by querying the updated models that you have, right? And so that's, so Hasura kind of, you can think of that basically, if I looked at that mutation response that I had here, right? Create artist, and then I was looking at, let's look at the previous one that I had, which was, I think, the hello example. Right. So in this case, you can imagine that Hasura is almost running this query with some parameters, right? And Hasura is running that query to give you that data, right? In fact, I didn't talk about this, but Hasura also has sync and async actions, which means that you can do a mutation and not get the response immediately, but you can do mutation followed by a subscription. So you can do a mutation, get an ID, and subscribe to that ID. And then whenever that response, whenever the right models get updated, you will be able to subscribe to that data as it's changed, right? Imagine like you're doing like an image conversion or a PDF conversion that takes a long time or whatever, right? And so that's kind of that's kind of the architectural pattern that we follow with actions. And this is a really interesting pattern because it like really helps you think about like your like building these backend business logic things in a fairly scalable way, right? Especially if you think you're a large, if you're kind of like a larger team, right? You can just keep adding these actions or these business logic handlers, and the people who are building these pieces of business logic, they can be building their own microservices, they can be building their own serverless functions, whatever, it doesn't matter. uh, the point is that the unified, like the API that the consumer sees, is a nice coherent GraphQL API, but the way it's implemented on the back, just totally depends on the way you've done it, the way your team is structured, the way your developers are, right? Whether it's one developer doing it or whether it's a team doing it, and however you've decided to federate that responsibility, right? And so it becomes a nice, easy way to keep just thinking about adding. Like you want to add more actions, you just keep adding more actions, and it's fairly easy to evolve the system without having to go in and kind of change the way models are structured necessarily, or optimize them for CRUD, right? It's like, oh, but I need to do a CRUD, and the way I do an update mutation, we'll have to update it by like having these columns. Don't worry about it. Write an update action that represents your action, and then go update the models so that they're optimized for read. And this just makes it very easy to think about continuously adding more and more business logic, right? So that's kind of the underlying pattern that Hasura follows, and I've talked about it a little more in that blog post.
Okay, so I have another question. Someone saying, I'm really interested by the simplified name inflector as well, because right now it's hard to customize fields and type namings globally.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. So we have that we land that as a part of Relay as well. So right now you can go and customize like what Hasura generates at a per type and field level, which is inconvenient. And so we'll be able to customize that globally. So for example, what you can do is you can change that to like, I don't have albums by PK, I want to have album, right? Or I want to have like album aggregate. I want to camel case it, but you don't want to camel case like 1,000 tables. And so as we land Relay, we'll be also adding a few inflection systems so that you can choose a default naming scheme. And then of course you can go override it at a per type field resolver level, but we'll also have a default naming scheme that's easier. Yeah, it's one of those things that really shows our background as people who are new to the GraphQL ecosystem back in the day, because we were snake case. And that's, you can see that clearly playing out. But we're becoming camel case soon, don't worry.
Okay. Someone is worried that he won't be able to use Apollo. It will be Relay only, but no, that's not the case.
Yeah, no, that's not the case. You can continue to use Apollo client. You can continue to use, or you can switch over to Relay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we definitely do not like breaking APIs. I think in the last 1.5 years, we have not broken APIs. We're very scared of breaking APIs. We hate it. And so, yeah, so even if we add relay or we add whatever feature, you can be absolutely confident that it won't break something that you had working already.
Okay. And it's yeah, someone wants to. He's using Apollo right now, and he wants to switch to relay. That's what he's saying. Okay, it looks like we don't have more questions for now. Let me check. Okay, someone is asking on the chat, can we reuse enum types in actions?
Not yet. There is an open issue. So right now you have to redeclare that enum, but very soon we'll have a way to reuse enum types as well. So you can already reuse Hasura scalars that Hasura defines, like timestamp TZ and GeoJSON and a bunch of other things, like for geography and GIS and whatnot. But if you've defined enums at the Hasura level using a table, that cannot be reused in actions yet. You just have to redeclare that as an enum and then declare it yourself. But in the next 1 or 2 releases, we'll have that as well.
Okay. And do you think we'll get JSON-based schema validation one day, or is it
one day, yes. Yeah, no, it's not terribly complicated. I think it's an opinion thing, right? Like it's like the reason.
Yeah.
So for example, one of the simplest ways of creating like a schema on top of JSONB, right, is to create a view that extracts the right fields from the underlying JSONB column, right? That it's like it's almost as if that is a better way of doing it because you're doing it within Postgres's like all of Postgres's features are available to you, right? Like to extract the right fields of JSON and stuff like that. You don't have to do it at the GraphQL level. So there is a way of doing that automatically, where you expose that whole type. But yeah, we are thinking about it. There is a workaround that's available right now, but sort of workaround. But we are definitely thinking about adding validation for JSON and JSONB as well.
Okay. And there's a big feature that and I think many people were asking
Yeah,
since
no, I remember.
years ago.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
nested update.
Yes, nested update is
So
also in
I know there's
progress.
an RFC about this.
Yeah.
And
So we started work on it already, and it might not happen by the 1.3 release, but it might make its way to 1.4, 1.5.
okay. Okay. Is there anything else you would like to share with us before we end?
I would just quickly like to plug the fact that we are doing HasuraCon. It's our first user conference. It's a big moment for us. Please, if you are using Hasura, please do feel free to submit a talk. And if you'd like to find out more about Hasura, we have some amazing speakers and some amazing workshops. Please do feel free to register. It's going to be all online. It's entirely free. It's mostly going to be a lot of users and community folks talking about stuff. So feel free to join us there. This is happening in the first week of June.
Awesome. Congrats.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thanks everyone, and thanks Tanmai for your time. It was
Absolutely. Thanks for having me,
great
Patrick.
demo.
Hope this was useful.
Yep, sure was. All right, cheers everyone. Bye bye.
Bye, folks. Stay safe.